Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is from Passion to Action, the Earth Week Environmental Justice Workshop. My name is Jeremy Sanford, and I'm an undergraduate senior, in addition to being a student intern at the UW-Madison Office of Sustainability. I'm here to help guide you through this presentation today, so I hope you can stand the sound of my voice. Before we start, I'd like to thank my colleague, Natalie Brunner, in addition to all of the other wonderful Office of Sustainability staff that helped to put this together. Before we get into it, I want to provide a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to start by looking into environmental justice at large and environmental racism, what the terms mean and the interplay between the two. Then we're going to go into a brief history of the environmental justice movement throughout the US. We're going to follow that up by going into some case studies, looking at a local, national, and global view. We will then go into the impacts of COVID-19 on environmental justice efforts. We'll then wrap up by showing you all how you can take action and learn more about efforts in your local communities. So we need to start by defining what environmental justice is. As per the EPA, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Now that's a mouthful, but basically what that says is environmental justice is the idea that everybody should have equal access to a clean environment which enables them to fulfill their desires in their community and make long-lasting community partnerships and relationships. So efforts in order to improve environmental integrity can include clean air measures, clean water measures, making sure people have access to proper waste facilities, such as landfills and recycling facilities, minimizing the number of people who are exposed to hazardous wastes, which can potentially lead to a number of catastrophic side effects, and ensuring that people have good access to things like public transportation and nutrient-rich foods. These are just some examples, but these are some main examples of environmental justice efforts. If we talk about environmental justice, we have to talk about environmental racism, because race is the number one factor that comes into play when determining somebody's exposure and vulnerability to environmental hazards. The role of race cannot be undersold at all. So one definition of environmental racism is the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color due to the existence of institutional rules, regulations, government policies, and/or corporate decisions that deliberately target certain communities for locally undesirable land uses and lax enforcement of zoning and environmental laws. So another mouthful, but basically what that's talking about is the prominence of environmental law being neglected or unenforced in areas that are filled with people of color. So that can mean people of color having more exposure to hazardous wastes than their white counterparts in certain communities. That can mean not having access to good food, transportation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if we're going to dive into a brief history of the environmental justice movement in the US, we're going to start in the 1960s, where we see things like Cesar Chavez leading groups of Latino workers in San Joaquin, California. We also see African American students rallying across the country to raise awareness about issues such as these. In the 1980s, we see more protests by African American demonstrators bringing light to their exposure to contaminated soils running through their communities. In the 90s, we see some positive change in terms of recognition of environmental justice and the adverse health effects on low-income people and people of color. Unfortunately, under the Bush administration in the 2000s, we see rollback of rhetoric that shines light on the disproportionate impacts of environmental hazards and devastation. So that is very unfortunate. But if we look to the Obama administration, we see work to integrate environmental justice ideals into the EPA. their permitting and rulemaking process. And even today, you see EPA having a lot of information surrounding environmental justice, local efforts to improve environmental conditions for communities, and that sort of thing. So that is a very positive development that came out of all of this time. But most recently, we do see, unfortunately, rollbacks of environmental protections, including clean air, clean water regulations that were put in place under the Obama administration that are being rolled back by the Trump administration. Most notably, the pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, the international agreement by the United States is devastating, considering that climate change is a very real phenomena and it will have catastrophic impacts if it is not mitigated. So one thing to keep in mind, of course, is that the effects of climate change are most pronounced on people of color and people of lower income. Those people that don't have a lot of voice in these conversations are typically the ones who are most impacted, unfortunately. And ignoring climate change is going to most obviously affect these people. So we're going to transition into some case studies now. We're going to look at a Wisconsin level, a national level, the international level. We can start by looking at some examples of environmental injustice in the state of Wisconsin. Redlining was a practice that was a result of New Deal legislation. It was carried out by lending organizations towards people of color. It was denying them loans in order to prevent them from locating in certain places in urban areas. And it had a rampant effect in terms of propagating segregation in cities. You can see in the map here that Milwaukee is one of the most segregated cities in America, and you can see the segregation based off of race that persists in the Milwaukee area as a result of practices like redlining. If we look at Madison, we can even see a lack of access to transportation for people of color. In Madison, transportation in terms of the bus line is separated on East Coast or East-West basis and North-South basis. And in the North-South areas of Madison, you have people of color and people of lower income levels. In the East-West parts of Madison, you have white people and people of higher income levels, typically. And this is what you typically see in Madison. When deciding to expand bus transit, the city of Madison decided to first prioritize the east-west sides of Madison, even though they have more public transportation bus routes than the north-south sides. And the north-south sides are full of people who typically would benefit the most from increased access to public transportation. People of lower income levels and people of color. We can take a look out, take a zoom out and look at the entire country, and we can see trends of environmental injustice that we see at the local level as well. In terms of food justice, according to the USDA, about 17% of the US population had low access to a supermarket due to lack of transportation or poor placement of stores. So that has a lot of implications for people's ability to consume nutrient-rich foods in the country. Additionally, about 12% of American households experience food insecurity in 2017 at some point during the year. You can see trends of Black households having the highest rates of food insecurity, followed by Hispanics, compared to only 8% of white households. So you can see the distinction in access to food that can sustain you and make sure you're doing well and myriad of aspects in life. You can also see some statistics about the disparity between the percentage of income spent on food between average households and poor households. Uh, Poor households spend a larger percentage of their income on food. In terms of pollution exposure, there's definitely a history of race and lower income populations being more exposed to pollutions that to pollutants that can have catastrophic effects on their health and well-being for the long term. We can see a history of racist zoning policies, relegated people of color to more at-risk areas, like we were talking about earlier. Having hazardous waste next to you is not something that is good for the long-term well-being and success of the community and the community's health. And you can also recognize the fact that the indigenous population of the country is often exposed to a number of pollutants and potential harms that result in the indigenous population of the country having the highest cancer rate in the country. We can see 15% of coal reserves and almost 40% of uranium reserves located on indigenous land that has a number of negative ramifications in terms of health and in terms of long-term success for a community. When we look at energy, we can see that people who are not as well off financially and people who belong to minority populations are most at risk to fuel poverty, which is not being able to pay for or not having quality access to adequate energy services. It's an unfortunate trend, and we also see the trend of people lower on the socioeconomic ladder spending a higher percentage of their income on energy, similar to how they spend a higher percentage of their income on food. And in the energy field, we see that they use less energy than the average household, but spend a higher percentage of their income on energy, which is fundamentally problematic and exacerbates the poverty cycle. If we zoom out even further, we can see the impacts of environmental injustices in a number of nations across the globe. When we look at e-waste, we see that we generate around 50 million tons of e-waste every year. Mostly Western countries are the main perpetrators in terms of e-waste generation. You also have China being a major player, and Japan and India. And the amount of e-waste is expected to increase as we get more and more industrialization and modernization with higher degrees of turnover for technological devices. And there's a tremendous amount of e-waste that does not get recycled. Around 80% doesn't get recycled. And there are studies that link e-waste sites with surrounding communities having higher rates of structural DNA damage, stillbirths, and premature births, which is extremely problematic. And on the globalization front, we see that often nations that have the most e-waste generation are exporting the negative impacts of their actions onto people who are not main contributors to the e-waste problem. So you see developing countries like India or Nigeria or Ghana, where there are a ton of these e-waste dumping sites and people are exposed to these toxic fumes and pollutants, and the negative impacts of being around those. We talked about increased percentage of stillbirths, potentially, of premature births, and structural DNA damage. It's really frightening. If we bring things into an even more modern context, we can see the impacts of the COVID-19 virus on environmental justice issues. We talked about food security before and how there are a number of people across the country that are food insecure. But some more statistics on that. Around 30 million children in the US receive free or reduced cost meals or when they go to their public school. And obviously, public schools are closed right now. So that's 30 million children that may not have access to food because they're not going to school. And their parents are struggling financially, so they may not be able to provide them the food that they need. On top of that, the unemployment rate has skyrocketed since the onset of COVID, with around 21 million jobless claims being filed since the beginning of the outbreak. That's moving the unemployment rate from around 4% to around 13%. And if we don't adhere to certain social distancing guidelines, we can see an increased spread, which would lead to higher unemployment. If we also look at the impacts of COVID-19, we can see it is disproportionately affecting people of color. In places like Chicago, the Black population make up around 30% of the city, while they account for around 50% of the total COVID-19 cases and 70% of all the deaths related to COVID-19. This is a similar trend that we see in places like Milwaukee across the country. In New York City, we see the Hispanic population is the most at risk to COVID-19. And across the country, we see around a third of patients hospitalized for COVID-19 are Black, while the African American population is only 13% of the US population. And we also have a quote down here from the Surgeon General of the US acknowledging that COVID-19 has disproportionate impacts on specifically African Americans because of the history of racism and racist practices, in addition to health disparities that permeate through our discourse and our policy making to this day. So another impact of COVID-19 that may be unanticipated is the positive effect it's had on air quality in some parts of the world. So pollution has definitely decreased across the globe with the onset of COVID-19, since there is a downturn in terms of human activity, obviously. So China's CO2 emissions have decreased by around 25% from where they were last year. And we can see particulate matter concentrations decreasing in certain places like San Francisco and New York City and Seattle. So this is an interesting point that I wanted to bring up because common criticism of environmental efforts and people making arguments for environmental sustainability is humans are entrenched in their activities and there isn't much that we can do to prevent climate change at this point and the negative impacts of climate change and that sort of thing. So this shows that that's not true. We can do what we can and we can see positive felt ecologically around us. And obviously, if we have a healthy environment, we have an increased number of people who can live up to their potential, an increased number of people who can make partnerships in their community and can live happily. All right, we're going to transition to a little bit of reflection time now. So we prepared two questions today. The first one is asking you to think of any instance of environmental injustice that you can recognize in your own community. So think about from where you're listening today, and think about other places you've lived in the past, and think on if you can see any instance of maybe there not being good grocery stores in a lower income part of town, or there being a lack of public transportation options in a lower income part of town. maybe an area that's populated by a lot of people of color is close to disposal facilities. There are a number of issues that you can think of that qualify as environmental injustice. So think on that. And the second question, think about any ways that you believe you can help. So any ways you can be an effective ally. So I'll give you about a minute to do so. You've got about 30 seconds remaining. All right, in the final 15 or so seconds, wrap up whatever thought you have right now. All right, so we're going to move on, but I want you to, at the end of this presentation, look back on your responses to these reflection questions, and I want you to take action. So if you recognize an instance of environmental injustice in your community, don't be passive about it. Be active about it. Be active in fighting. Be active in being an ally. If you were a little bit lacking in ways you think you can help, we have some ways that we believe are effective in helping to fight for environmental justice. Um, some of these include speaking up. So obviously these are not comfortable conversations to have in daily life at the dinner table, but these issues are very important and affect a tremendous number of people that often do not have voice to speak for themselves in the decision-making process. So the more people we have talking about these issues, the better the long-term solutions will be. I think prior to speaking up, we all share the responsibility of listening to others who share or who have. So we validating other people's experiences and understanding where they're coming from, understanding their perspective is super valuable for bridge building and moving forward as a coalition to enact effective change. In addition to listening to others, is looking it up. A factual basis for what you're saying is vital for getting the change we need enacted and the discourse shifted. In addition to being informed and listening and speaking up, you need to show that you support these initiatives. You support marginalized communities who historically have faced discrimination that's hampered their ability to be long-standing pillars in communities. So show support for those businesses. Vote, show your representatives that issues of environmental justice are issues for the entire community, not just a subsect that doesn't have a lot of power. So show that your vote matters and show that this is an important topic to you. And lastly, we have consume consciously. So fair trade items, rainforest certified items, they make sure that environmental harms are reduced to the fullest extent possible through the supply chain, through manufacturing, through transportation, etc. So those are items and organizations that we should definitely support with our dollars. Now some campus organizations that do good work in terms of environmental justice issues. We have the Sierra Student Coalition, so the student organization for the Sierra Club at Madison, aims just to develop environmental leaders for the future. So that means getting involved, volunteering, training, and organizing. That's something that we definitely need going forward. And Sierra Student Coalition is definitely an effective organization for teaching those types of skills. We have the Food Recovery Network, which works to recover extra food from dining halls and bring it to various outlets on campus that supply people with food if they are food insecure or just in need of a good meal. We also have Urban, which is an organization that focuses on supplying students with the skills necessary to enable them in becoming responsible business leaders of the future. This can include efforts to improve the sustainability of a particular private business or to improve the surrounding area's sustainability and environmental equity. If you look at the city of Madison, you can also see a number of organizations dedicated towards raising awareness about environmental justice issues. These include the Midwest Environmental Justice Organization, the Wisconsin Network for Peace, Justice, and Sustainability, and the Wisconsin Conservation Voters, which is an organization dedicated towards raising awareness about issues related to land conservation, water conservation, and other issues of public health. So if you have the time, I would recommend volunteering to these organizations because they're doing good work. Here's a list of organizations operating during the COVID-19 crisis. Like we were talking about earlier with food insecurity, there are a ton of individuals who have less access to nutrient-rich food, especially with the crisis going on currently. So these organizations are currently accepting food donations. So I would encourage you to look into these organizations and find out how you can donate if you do have excess food. That can go towards helping somebody who is most at risk during the crisis. Here are some ways that we've recommended you can learn a little bit more about environmental justice. We have some reading here, including Garbage Wars, and we have some documentaries, including Rise, which is a documentary about the struggle for the indigenous population against an oil pipeline going through their land and extracting resources. So we always want to remember to be the best allies we can and to stand with those who often do not have a voice and often are not provided for by the institutions we typically rely on. That does it for this presentation today. So I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in today for giving some attention. And I'd like to thank once again my colleagues at the Office of Sustainability who helped to put this together. We have a great team and we work really hard, and I'd like to congratulate them on a fantastic Earth Week. So we have some information here about how you can learn more about what we do. You can follow us on social media, sign up for our newsletter, and yeah, that's all for now. So thank you so much again, and you have a great rest of your week.